Ian Lindsay of Lindsay and Associates has played an active role in the local community since 1979. He has been with RE/MAX, Vancouver Island's most advanced real estate business network, since 1996, marketing and selling residential, rural, strata, recreational investment, and project development real estate. You'll find true real estate professionals at ianlindsay.ca.
You're listening to Nonpartisan Hacks, the podcast about good government from the local level on up. I'm Sean Wood, councillor and mayoral candidate with the City of Parksville.
And I'm Joel Grenz, also a Parksville City Councillor. Quick disclaimer before we start, the views expressed here are our own and don't represent Parksville Council or the city or any other body we are a part of.
Let's begin with a massive thank you from here in Parksville on Vancouver Island to our big whitefish BC guest today for taking time out of his still busy holiday schedule, Mr. John Rustad.
John recently stepped aside as leader of the BC Conservative Party. He was first elected to the BC Legislature in 2005 as the MLA for the riding now called Nechako Lakes. John served as Minister of Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation and also held critic portfolios and eventually became leader of BC Conservative Party and almost premier.
With BC politics fragmenting, new parties emerging and dissolving, and voters simply wanting functional, competent governance, we wanted to talk to John about leadership, governance, and how he sees the province today.
John Rustad, welcome to Nonpartisan Hacks.
Thank you for having me on today.
John, I wanted to mention before we get going that if we hear any birds chirping in the background, it's not because we're recording outside, because we often do record outside. Weather's not quite cooperating for that today, but it's because my daughter has two small parrots in the room next to us. And I bring that up too because did I hear correctly that you have a parrot?
Yes, I've got an African gray parrot. She's about 31, 32 years old, and she talks up a storm.
Really?
She'll mimic just about anything that you can think of. And so she often adds some interesting commentary from time to time.
Well, we should have her on the podcast.
I could arrange that. I could have her come up and sit on my shoulder, but might start chewing the keyboard.
That'd be great. We also have a macaw as well upstairs, and she can get pretty loud too.
The thing about having a parrot, they're a great creature, but they're a lifelong pet, of course. I mean, it's going to outlive Kim and I. But it gives you a laugh every day. There's something that she'll say or something that she'll do that just, makes you just kind of just look and just all you can do is laugh. It's like, how does she come up with that?
I should have my daughters on because they are parrot experts. It's their parrots. And so we at one point had 4 parrots in our house. So maybe the next podcast will be the parrot podcast.
Yeah, maybe. But she's taking a course right now to saying Merry Christmas. And so she'll say good morning and Merry Christmas. And I'll just give you one little tidbit. So if I'm lazy in the morning, I haven't taken a shower quite yet. Yardy will start asking me if I'm going to take a shower. She'll say, "You taking a shower?" And if after a period of time, if I haven't, she'll say, "Go take a shower."
Wow.
Do they have a good sense of smell as well, John, or no?
Apparently she must. I don't know.
Oh, wow. Okay. I did not know that about parrots. I'm learning.
I wish my parrots would nag my children more too. Please brush your teeth, take a shower, clean your room.
We wanted to start by letting you speak to some of the big things that you got accomplished. And what comes to mind is getting the BC NDP government to reverse course on decrim or the carbon tax. But we're guessing you might have other things that you're happy to have been a strong part of bringing forward. What are some other big wins which the majority of people in BC likely appreciate that come to mind?
What's actually happened with the Conservatives on the scene is it really has changed the political narrative. And I had, even when it was just myself in the legislature, you could see the narrative from the NDP and at the time the BC Liberals/United Party were changing in terms of the questions they'd ask and how they would approach answers. Then, of course, Bruce Bamman joined me and we came on stream and started being very aggressive in question period on a daily basis. I used to have NDPers that come up to me and would say, "Boy, it's amazing how things have changed." And it's because of the approach that we took. We were very aggressive, particularly on social issues. We were very aggressive on things like the carbon tax. And that really drove a lot of change in narrative in the political scenes.
And do you give Premier Eby a little bit of credit for pivoting, or do you think it's kind of just pure pressure that the majority of BC were behind those things that kind of forced him to change course?
Well, David Eby is a man of convictions. He's a person who is very comfortable with telling lies, and I'm sorry for putting it so bluntly, but he just is. He's very comfortable with just saying whatever he thinks he needs to say to get a vote. And so as the political narrative in the province changes, he tries to change his position or his commentary to suit whatever that narrative is that's going on in the province. And it's your typical politicians, not to label all politicians the same way, but they often try to figure out where the public is and try to get in front of it, as opposed to leading and trying to drive where things should go in the province, which is what I've always tried to do.
Well, that's a good pivot into the next thing we want to sort of chat about, which is the topic of leadership more broadly. And over your years, you've served under several leaders. In fact, I've got a list of 7 I'd like to chat about if you're willing to. So I wonder if we might be able to go through some of these leaders, or my list here, and work our way to you becoming leader. And maybe you can speak to the lessons you've learned about leadership, starting with Gordon Campbell. And you were first elected under Gordon Campbell's leadership, I guess, for context.
Yeah. So in 2005, I was elected under Gordon Campbell. And one thing I noticed when I was out campaigning is lots of people saying that they'd vote for me, but they don't like the leader. And that was true for every leader that I served under. And I don't know why. It's just, there's always people that focus on some of the negatives. I thought Gordon Campbell was a very good premier. He actually got a lot of things done in this province that he will be remembered for as being a builder in terms of those sort of things. He was also about a very strong personality. He drove things. He was a very smart man, or is a very smart man, and so he liked to have hands-on control in terms of a lot of ministries and the approach that he took. Going on, when when Gordon had stepped down and Christy won the leadership, Christy was a very different style. She was very enabling in her style. She wasn't nearly as conservative in many of her approaches that she would take, but she was very much, giving a minister a task and then allowing the minister to do the task, as opposed to, Gordon would be very engaged and involved in terms of things that you'd be doing. So different leadership styles, but both of them I thought were, effective in terms of what they were trying to achieve.
One thing I think you could maybe say about, for sure, Gordon Campbell, but also Christy Clark, is they seem to bring a pretty strong vision for the province to the table, and they seem to have a pretty clear direction about where they wanted to take the province down the road. Maybe you can speak a little bit to the importance of having that vision, and how do you generate that vision? Where does that come from?
Gordon, when he was first elected, of course, he was elected in the 90s, did not win the 96 election, had to fight to stay on, holding on to his grip on power. In terms of leadership, and then of course won a massive mandate in 2001. And he had a vision in terms of smaller government and much more focused on the economy, lower taxes, lower touch by government. As he went on in his years, he changed a little bit. When he introduced the carbon tax, and he changed his approach a little bit in terms of politics, and lost a little bit of his original vision, I think. But part of that is, governments and leaders do need to change a little bit, because obviously you get elected to do a bunch of things, then you do them. You can't be running on a platform saying, I'm still going to be doing them, right? You need to be moving on to doing something else, because otherwise, I thought you'd already done this. What's your platform? So there was definite shift, but over time, particularly with the BC Liberals, which then ultimately became the BC United Party, the focus really was lost from the standard conservative policies of good governance, small government, freedom for people, et cetera, into more of a middle of the road type of liberal type of approach. It was still conservative in many aspects, but became more liberal as time went on over the party. And I think that's ultimately what led to the downfall of the BC Liberal / BC United Party.
Okay. Well, we'll get there. I think I've still got my little list here, so maybe we'll go on to the next one. So we had Gordon Campbell, Christy Clark. They both had success with their leadership and both became premier. The next one in the list is Andrew Wilkinson, who took over the BC Liberal Party after Christy Clark and maybe served during a bit of a difficult time for the province around COVID. But are there lessons learned from that phase of leadership as you worked your way to eventually yourself becoming leader?
So Andrew, I supported Andrew in his leadership bid, going through his process. Andrew was definitely more of a left of center type of leader in his approach. Very, very smart man. And I think one of the things that I noted about Andrew is he had this sort of vision in terms of where he wanted to go things, and he wasn't shy about basically saying to the Conservatives, you guys are going to have to take a back seat. He kind of joked about that once at a fundraiser that he did. And I think that really started a big divide in the party in terms of, speaking to both sides, because ultimately in British Columbia, we have historically been a two-party system. Mm-hmm. Ever since the 1940s, we've been a two-party system. And so the center-right party always is a blend of liberal and conservative, and it always has that tension and balance between sort of the liberal side and the conservative side. Mm-hmm. And under Andrew, we went more into the liberal side and really had the conservative side doing more of a backseat, which is unfortunate. But that was sort of more his style and approach that he took.
So maybe the lesson is that nobody wants to take the back seat, really, right?
Well, it's not so much that. I think the lesson out of all of this, and whether it's Gordon or Christy or Andrew, was you need to make sure that both sides of that political coin can be together in the same tent. You've got to keep things at a very high level so that people can see how they fit into the situation. Because as soon as you start delving into the detail, the minutia, the how do you actually do a few things on the ground, that's where you get the main divisions between mm-hmm. sort of a liberal and conservative, because mm-hmm. each have a different idea in terms of what they want to see. But at a high level, they are very much in agreement. And so that's always the big challenge, I think, for a center-right party.
Yeah, y'all will, what subjects are on the fringe that we shouldn't really be working on, and what ones are common ground, and this is what the majority of BC people want to see, and let's focus on these.
Yeah, like I say, the other thing that in all the leadership, and this has never changed for me, but as I watched it through the various leaders that I served under, you have to have a vision. You have to paint where things are going. If you don't, you're going to be torn apart in terms of things. And so it's much easier, of course, when you're a government, because government has its own way of exerting sort of a command and control over MLAs. Opposition is much more difficult because it has more of an independent perspective in terms of where they think things should go.
Yeah, you don't have a premier's office, and obviously there's a lot of power currently that resides in there.
Well, if you think about everybody who's elected, and I think this is with very few exceptions, everybody who's elected wants to be a cabinet minister, and all cabinet ministers want to be a premier. And so you're always, dealing with that dynamic in society, right? In terms of, in a caucus, mm-hmm. is everybody sort of juxtapositions, and there's very few politicians that I've seen that have left politics that haven't had the line, if they only had to listen to me, it would have been different.
Right. Yeah, of course.
Oh, maybe we'll get into that question later.
We're all heroes of our own story, John. Yes.
All right. Well, so now the leader that wasn't, but you did support in the next leadership race, Ellis Ross. What leadership lessons did you glean from that stage?
Ellis, and then when it comes to politics, there's an old saying for leaders. They kind of have a little bit of what is called a royal jelly, just a way that they can connect and attach and connect to people just in the broader public. And Ellis had a little bit of that royal jelly, has a little bit of that, right? People like him. He like his approach. He's straight up, he's very straightforward in how he does things. And he's, a very likable person, and obviously very successful in what he's been able to achieve over the years as well. So it was easy to support somebody like Ellis and going through the process. Mm-hmm. And I think, things that have been different. If Ellis had become the leader of the BC Liberal Party, quite frankly, I think it still would be around today.
Yeah, that was a pretty pivotal leadership there in terms of the trajectory of the province, for sure. Which does take us to Kevin Falcon. What you served under him for a time. What leadership lessons did you take away from that?
Kevin Falcon was very much a bit of a hard-nosed, get-it-done type person when he was a minister.
Yeah,
he was
Minister of Red Tape Reduction.
Yeah, both red tape reduction and transportation. He would just, damn the torpedoes, so I'm going to just do this. He would be given a mandate from his leader, and off he would go and get things done in terms of it. As a leader, I think the biggest challenge that Kevin had is his window for becoming leader was the 2011 a leadership race, where Christy Clark ultimately won. And so he spent the better part of a decade planning to become leader of the party at some point in the future. And I think his thinking didn't change a whole lot, even though the political environment had changed. So, I mean, he's a very strong individual, very capable individual. But the one thing that really, hit me, that was one of the reasons why I could never really fully support him, was, he came out at one point during the leadership race and he said, the NDP have got a bunch of really good ideas. They just don't know how to implement them. And I just sat back and I thought, I can't think of a single idea that is good that the NDP have done. And I'm like, what do you mean? I mean, you might say things like $10 a day daycare, but I mean, everybody would love that. It would be great if you could implement something like that, but I mean, it's completely unrealistic in terms of government resources and the ability to actually do these things. But so that to me was kind of a defining moment in terms of, okay. And so when Kevin won the leadership, I told him, I said, look, I'm not going to create any problems for you. I'll just go about doing business. If you want me to, stay on doing the critic stuff, I'll do that. You're the leader, and we've got to be able to move forward, which is how I did operate under him. But there was an issue that came up. The federal government put forward a paper called the Farm Emissions Reduction Strategy, which is a fancy way of saying they wanted to reduce, CO2 emissions from farms. And for some reason, they wanted to reduce the use of nitrogen-based fertilizer because they felt nitrogen was a problem. Nitrogen is the most abundant, molecule in the atmosphere. I can't understand why they would think it's a problem, but whatever. I looked at that policy and I thought, this is going to dramatically hurt my riding. About 35% of the economic activity in my riding is agriculture, particularly ranching, right, cow-calf operations. And so I tried to have a conversation about this, and actually Kevin refused to allow us to have a conversation in caucus. He refused to allow this topic to come up. And so it was in August of 2022, and I started looking at this, thought, well, I'm going to start making a little bit of noise on this. So I just did a retweet of a Patrick Moore tweet, which questioned the role of CO2 and talked a little bit about the Great Barrier Reef. And somehow that became, DEFCON 3 or whatever, right? I mean, Kevin just went the deep end on it and demanded I remove the tweet. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. If this is a conversation that needs to be had. And then they booted me out. And so I just went, okay, that's interesting. But, I just look at it as, from my perspective, it was a bit of a failure. And because Kevin, wasn't able to engage on a simple topic like this, is how do you have a conversation about this that's impacting a riding in the province of British Columbia?
And we see so many, John, especially at local government, so many policies that come out of Victoria that are kind of this broad brush. And we don't see the conversations happening with the people on the ground that it's going to impact, whether it's decriminalization or whether it's a tax that's going to impact farmers' bottom lines or reduce the amount of agriculture that they can produce. We really need to see those conversations happening with people who are on the ground. It's like being in Victoria and telling firefighters or how to do their job or how cops to do their job. It's very, very difficult, and you have to make sure you interact with the people who your policies are going to impact the most before you use a big broad brush like that tax you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And so you start looking at all these things, and my perspective is you will never make everybody happy, right? There's enough diverging perspectives in the province of British Columbia that there is no policy that everybody will be happy with. And so all you can do is you can do one of two things. You can try to figure out where everybody is and get in front of it, or you can lead with a vision. and try to implement what's needed to be done in the province.
Yeah, and I'd like to get back into some of that stuff, but maybe we'll take a slight detour to talk about, we are nonpartisan hacks here, so let's talk about the other side of the aisle. You've served as in the opposition side under John Horgan's premiership. Maybe what are some takeaways from that leader?
It's interesting in terms of John Horgan. I actually like John. I thought he was an interesting individual. Back when we were both, like, I was on a backbench, I wasn't a minister, and he was elected. He wasn't the leader of the party. We served on a number of committees together over time, and had quite a few conversations. I'll never forget one committee that we were on where it was the BC Liberals that were running the committee. NDP were on the committee, and there was lots of banter and going back and forth, and the NDP were really sort of niggling on some politics, and so I'd had enough, and so I gave it back to them, right, in terms of politics, and that really pissed off John. And John turned to the chair and said, "Are you going to put up with this?" And the chair said, he said, "Well, both sides are doing this." And John grabbed his books and stood up and said, "If this is the way that you're going to run this committee, you can take this effing committee and shove it." Right? He used different language. He used the full language, right? He stormed out of the room. Well, of course, he said it loud enough that Hansard picked it up.
Wow.
And so he had to go into the legislature and apologize afterwards for the use of the language. But I mean, that's John, right? I mean, he was some people called him Angry John and other sides things.
But he had his emotions on his sleeve for sure.
The one sort of knock I would say about John, I mean, I think in terms of managing, of course, I'm not happy with the NDP policies, but he actually was a pretty reasonable premier in terms of, particularly on the fiscal side, way too much in taxes and that side of things. But I mean, he did leave the province with a surplus at the time when he left. But I'll never forget one thing he did say, which was, mining has enormous potential in British Columbia. We've got 27 mines, potentially going forward. 17 are actually close to being able to be developed, represent about a $40 billion investment, not to mention the tens of thousands of jobs and revenues. But John Horgan once said, for the Northwest, which is where a lot of these mines are, he said, "Well, I can see us developing one new mine per generation." And I thought about that. I thought, what is that saying? It's saying that we've got this enormous resource potential in British Columbia. That's where they need the revenue. We need the jobs. We need to be able to improve services. But he doesn't see it that way in terms of the sector. And that was a very telling insight into sort of his thinking. And I remember another time he was heckling about an oil pipeline going to the coast. I think this was Trans Mountain and Enbridge at the time that were talking about this. And they were saying, we actually need to do secondary manufacturing. We need refining capacity. And I stopped and I said, okay, which riding wants to host a refinery? Of course, silence. So it was great to have the rhetoric, but not necessarily the coming through with saying what should happen.
Yeah, or speaking to the full picture.
Yeah. One last little comment about John Horgan and when he was in his 2017 election, and he was going around, of course, trying to build up support, and he would say one thing to one group, one thing to another group, and he actually said, that he was just saying what he needed to do to try to get elected. And then once again, that was a pretty interesting little insight into his thinking. He wasn't able to sort of say with conviction what he wanted to do. He was just saying what he thought he needed to in order to get elected. And can't argue with this. He got elected. He ran as got reelected in 2020. So I guess that's the path that some leaders take, but not the path that I particularly like to see in a leader.
Yeah, that the formula can work, I guess, but yeah, tricky territory if you're not being consistent with what you're saying everywhere. That maybe takes us over to his successor, David Eby. What leadership takeaways do we have on David Eby? And you had an up-close perspective very recently.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of positive things to say about Mr. Eby. He's a politician who's really an activist, a fundamentalist, and he has no real principles in terms of how he does things. And so he's got this view of the province that is just completely inconsistent with reality in my perspective. I mean, he fully supports, decriminalization and opening drug use until it became a problem. And then he said, oh, maybe this is a failed experiment. He said we would be the last province ever to get rid of the carbon tax. It's the right thing to do because of, fires and floods and heat domes and all this kind of stuff. And even though I would continually argue that, taxing people into poverty is not going to change the weather, but he was very adamant. And then, of course, got rid of the carbon tax. Mm-hmm. What happened to conviction on this? Mm-hmm. Same thing when it comes to private property rights and Couchin. And I know the Couchin position, I know we'll get into that in a bit. But when he was on Haida Gwaii and did the agreement with the Haida people, where he determined that there would be Indigenous title underneath private property, he declared that to be his proudest moment in government. And I was like, does he not realize the damage that he has done and what he has created in terms of the risks and potentials going forward? But it's, once again, is just policy driven by ideology as opposed to looking to actually getting something done.
John, now that we've spoken about John Horgan and David Eby, you might have some insight into how their offices worked with their ministers. And, from an amateur outside viewpoint myself, it seems like John Horgan allowed his ministers, gave them a lot of empowerment. Hey, go get this stuff done. If you need help, let me know, but you're on your own, get some stuff done. And from my understanding, Premier Eby keeps a lot of the power in his office, and ministers have to run stuff by him. Does that sound like what's happening in your experience?
That's very accurate. Today, basically, Eby has a few ministers that he allows to do things. Everybody else is basically just a mouthpiece. They're there just to deliver messaging, and everything's being run out of the Premier's office. John Horgan was far more open with his ministers, allowing them to kind of go forward and stumble or succeed. And a similar, in similar vein, Gordon Campbell was pretty much a control person as well. He didn't control everything out of his office, but he had his fingers in everything that was going on. Christie was more of a hands-off. And so Christie and John Horgan were more like, Eby and Gordon Campbell were more like, and just in terms of that control. But I think Eby has gone way farther than Gordon ever did. Everything is basically done out of office. No minister can actually get anything done without getting approval out of Eby's staff.
Yeah, I mean, to my way of thinking, that would mean your office is very, very busy and less is going on, that your ministers feel like they don't have your trust and they don't have your empowerment to get the things done, and you're not really delegating. That's just kind of how I feel that would work out. It seems like John Horgan and Christy Clark, I guess, more empowered their ministers, which seems like a better way to go in my view.
Well, it has pluses and minuses. In terms of it, command and control is one form of government that a lot of leaders, over history have done. Some have been successful, some haven't been. The more distributed model, I think, is a better model, where you give ministers tasks, they go and do it, and if they fail, well, you replace the minister. If they succeed, you promote them, support them. As opposed to trying to have everything centralized. Because when you have everything centralized, everything has to fall on you as leader. And because you're the person who's calling all the shots. And so you can blame others, but ultimately it's, it lands in the Premier's office.
Well, one thing you do need, though, for that to work successfully is you also need to have a good team of MLAs with competence, the right skill set, knowledge, leadership skills, et cetera, to be able to deliver in their portfolios?
Well, part of that is development, obviously allowing MLAs, ministers to learn and to grow, and not to set them up for failure. Right? You try to give ministers tasks that they're capable of doing, that you think they're capable of doing, and then give them the opportunity to be successful or to exceed expectations. I'll never forget, and I had to really chuckle at this. And when I was appointed as Minister for Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation, Christy was taking a chance because she knew my perspective on it at the time. And so she decided to put me in this portfolio, and she gave me a task. She said, okay, I want you to sign 10 new, what was called non-treaty agreements. And I thought, okay, well, boy, we've only had 18 in BC's history. And you want me to sign 10 more? And they thought, well, this is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, ambitious.
Well, by the end of my term, I'd signed 435 agreements.
Wow. You exceeded expectations.
It was kind of interesting. I think back of the expectations when I first started. And I remember halfway through halfway through that particular term, Christie's staff came to me and said, well, we really need to set a new target, and what should we set as target? And I said, well, how many do you want? Like, what do you want me to do? Right?
On that topic, John, it seems like there are a few different parties which have different, I guess, goals of reconciliation. What do you feel like the majority of BC people's goal is with reconciliation, First Nations goals, and how do we figure out the common ground there?
Well, how much time do we have? Because this is a big topic.
Yeah.
But, I'll try to summarize
30 seconds
it.
Or less.
30 seconds left. So summarize it this way. The majority of people in British Columbia support the idea of reconciliation.
I agree.
But they don't support what is currently happening, which is, the secretive approach, and particularly when it starts to impact their personal lives, whether it's their property or whether it's their ability to access the backcountry or whether it is employment. And so it's the approach that has been taken, I think, has really hurt reconciliation in British Columbia. So my perspective on it is, this is what I call economic reconciliation. If it's about land and control of the land, whether it's crown land or whether it's title land or private land, it is doomed to fail, because you can't have 204 decision makers in the province. The province can't be carved up into that and expect to be able to function as a operating entity. So that means you need to find some other way to define what reconciliation is. And that's why the economic reconciliation, because one thing that is, in my time as minister and talking with nations since then, they are tired of managing poverty. They want to manage prosperity. They want to see hope. They want to have their young people, looking forward with optimism. They want to be able to support the culture and the language. They want to be able to be respected and to feel proud of who they are and what they represent, I should say. And there's only one way to do that is acceptable in the broader context of our society, and that is, you have to define what that means. So if you can define that from a perspective of, if you're engaged in the economy, if you're creating the employment opportunities, and if you're, people are successful in they're buying homes, they're buying cars, they're taking holidays, they're raising their kids are in schools, doing all the things, but at the same time, you're still respecting and supporting your culture and your language. I think that would be something that could be achieved. And so land can be returned strategically. But the key here is not to say that can be achieved by taking from one group of people and giving to another. Because if you do that, you just build resentment. You have to add to the economy. You have to add to what's going on so that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike can prosper and benefit from seeing reconciliation. And that, to me, is what our objective should be in British Columbia. We've gone horribly wrong, horribly sideways at this particular point with what's happened in British Columbia.
Yeah, well, you've mentioned that nobody is going to be happy about everything. I guess how do you get towards a place where you can make as many people in British Columbia happy without having sort of the zero-sum politics? One of the concerns around this whole issue is that we're risking as a province getting into kind of pitting groups against each other. So where you have Indigenous versus non-Indigenous, and obviously non-Indigenous is a much smaller group than the rest of the non-Indigenous population. So it's really risky potentially to fight elections or divide people along those lines. How do we get away from that?
Yeah, this is the real problem that now has been created. There's about 250, 300,000 Indigenous people in this province, about 100,000 of those are Métis. So you're really talking about 200,000, and then out of that, there's probably 100,000 that actually live on reserves. The rest are off reserves, if that. And so it's a very small proportion of society in terms of, we're 5 million people in this province, or give or take. And so this becomes the challenge. And what's happened now with HIDA, with the agreement there, and with the Cowichan decision, is it has completely undermined private property and private property rights. Our economy is founded on private property rights. Most of our society is founded on private property rights. And you've now basically thrown that completely out the door. And so nobody wants to invest in a province where you don't know what the rules are on the ground. Nobody wants, like, how do you sell your home? Why would you buy a home when you don't know what that's going to mean down the road? It's created a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And most people think this will get resolved one way or another. And it's not going to be, people's home being taken away or anything like that. But the challenge right now is all of this uncertainty that is being created, not to mention the fiscal liability that's created. Part of us, and this gets very complex in terms of, everything that's out there. But when you look at the Sokoteen case, which was the first Supreme Court of Canada ruling of title in British Columbia, which was up in the interior, in the Caribou region, it said very clearly that First Nations have the right to use, to go onto property, to use that property, and to benefit from that property that is defined as title. That can't coexist with your private property rights. So the two just cannot possibly exist. But more importantly, what the court also said is where that title is alienated. In other words, where it's being used for some other purpose by government, whether it's being logged or mined or private property, whatever the case may be.
Okay.
There needs to be compensation paid to the First Nation for loss of a historic value, but also current and future value. So if you think about it, in British Columbia, private property is worth about $2.8 trillion in this province. And
BC assessment?
Yeah, the BC assessment. So if the province has to compensate First Nations for title land, how does that work? If you think about it, that would bankrupt the province. So what does it mean? Does it mean that there'll end up being a property tax charged by the First Nations for your private property? Well, that's taxation without representation, because you can't vote for that government. Not to mention, in HIDA, in the agreement with HIDA, it was very clear that Indigenous law will apply to title land. That means the First Nations government can define its own laws, what you can and can't do on that land. Once again, you don't have a vote. You don't have a say, but it's going to be implemented on your private property. So there's a lot of uncertainty that is being created through this. And this is why I actually think the only solution to this, beyond going towards economic reconciliation we talked about, the only solution towards this is going to be a constitutional change. We are going to need to add into the Constitution private property rights and enshrine it and protect it in our Constitution. And on top of that, I think, quite frankly, we're probably going to have a conversation about redefining Section 35. There needs to be an end. Everybody agrees that reconciliation is important, but where does it end? How do you get to what is considered reconciliation? How do you then move beyond having two peoples with different rights in a constitution to getting to a place where everybody is equal under a constitution? And so I think there is going to need to be some significant changes to our constitution and to the approach in terms of how we address this historic wrong that has been done with First Nations, but at the same time creating a society that can move forward.
John, how much is that, this gigantic question, how much is that going to play into the next provincial election here in BC?
I think it'll be front and center. It'll be the question. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I was minister, I had to chuckle. It was, I think, 2014, early in 2014, and all the business leaders had come to meet with Christy and a number of our cabinet ministers. I was sitting around the table at the time. And the comment from the business community was, you need to triple John's budget. And I had to chuckle at the time because the business community gets it. Mm-hmm. You need to have certainty. You need to have a path that you can then invest in and understand what the rules will be, which is why, I ended up signing so many agreements over that period of time, because there was such a push to try to create, a path forward in terms of how money can be put to work and create jobs and create wealth and create, revenue for the province. And so, in terms of the next election, we are stuck with this issue. This is a defining issue. Now, it may not be on the front burner. People number one issue is affordability. Housing is a huge problem. Those are still going to be the number one and two issues in the province. Healthcare and crime are also, up there in terms of the top four. But this plays into all of that. And it used to be the one thing about, when I was minister, and I think it's very true today, this file, the Indigenous file, touches on everything that you do in government. It's one of the reasons why I enjoyed it, because it was, whether it's healthcare, whether it is social programs, whether it is economic programs, whether it is, anything that is happening, it touches every component of government. You cannot see anything happen without this issue being resolved. It is the elephant in the room.
I guess going back to Gordon Campbell, when you first were elected, Gordon Campbell had a big change of heart, maybe you could say, or change of perspective on Indigenous relations and reconciliation. I guess maybe you can speak a little bit to that, because there was a referendum. And we've had elections kind of on this before, and then Gordon Campbell understood that it would require coming to agreements across the province and treaty.
Yeah. So Gordon in 2001, right, there was the big pushback with what was going on with the Nisga'a Treaty. And so there was this push that, the people wanted to have a say. So they had a referendum. And coming out of that referendum, and once Gordon formed government, he quickly came to the realization that this is Section 35 of the Constitution. You can't do away with it. You can't use the notwithstanding clause. You can't avoid it. You have to address it. And so he then moved and pivoted to this path of how to address this issue. And ultimately, it moved forward to, in 2009, there was an act that was going to come forward, and it never did actually come forward, called the Reconciliation Act. I believe that's what it was called at the time. And actually, it would have redefined the 204 nations into about 32 or 34 different cultural groups, language groups, and sort of redefine how the whole politics would work. And he'd worked very hard for a number of years with the First Nation Leadership Council to get this done. Ultimately, caucus wouldn't support it. And then, of course, when it came out to the bands didn't support it. They didn't support the Leadership Council. The whole thing blew up. But it was an attempt at that point to try to find a different path forward instead of, the approach that had been taken. So it was, he recognized there's something different that needed to be done. And then that morphed into the, reconciliation work that started under Gordon after that, but then carried on with Christie, which ultimately is where I went in and took over that ministry for just over 4 years.
John, is there an overarching theme here that, the leader of the province should be pushing things that unify everybody in BC, people who buy the same trucks and shop at the same stores, and avoid kind of divisiveness and somehow bring everybody together to a brighter future? Is that kind of the idea of what a leader of BC should be doing?
Not necessarily. And the reason why I say that is leaders and governments need to make tough choices. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those choices are not popular because they have to be done. And there's a rule in economics called supply and demand, right? There will always be more demand than supply, which you'll have shortages, you'll have issues that pop up. It's the rule in economics, right? Supply and demand. And the number one rule in politics is to ignore that number one rule in economics. Is you want to promise everything to everyone, even though there is never going to be enough resources to go around. And so, governments, I believe, need to make tough choices. They need to set paths that ultimately solve problems for the broader public, but can't solve everything. And so it has to be choices. And in particular, there's sometimes you have to make choices that the public may not agree with. But in the long run, it will work well. It'll solve the problems. And I guess sometimes it's like taking medicine. Some people don't like to take the medicine, even though the medicine's the right thing to do. You
came very close to becoming premier. You could have been premier right now. So maybe that's a good opportunity to talk about some of those hard decisions that maybe you would be making right now. We've seen what's happened since that election. A lot of things have changed, but we've had a lot of challenges, whether it's tariffs. We've had a change in government federally. What decisions would you be making right now? And maybe what are some of the tough decisions that you would be making that you alluded to? You
have to think once again about what is the overall objective? What are you trying to achieve? And so if you're trying to achieve a stronger economy and, more affordability, and you're trying to address those issues, then your whole policies has to put things on with that lens. And so what has actually happened to people in British Columbia, and I would suggest people really throughout North America and probably through Europe as well, is a hollowing out of the middle class. Those that have resources are doing fine, right? They're able to carry forward, they're able to get through things, right? But those that don't have resources are struggling, and those that are in the middle that are trying to find the path are being pushed further and further into that category of not having the resources they need to be able to have, successful lives, however you want to define that. So that hollowing out of the middle class is a huge problem, and that needs to be fixed, I think. So you have to look at tax policies, you have to look at government directions and policies that are able to support the growth in that middle class and the resolving things like affordability. So, for example, food prices have gone up by 31% over the last number of years.
Mm-hmm.
Wages have not kept up. So that means more and more of your money that you have, your take-home money, is having to go just to put food on the table. Housing costs have gone up dramatically. Now, just recently, things like rent have come down a little bit, but it's still incredibly unaffordable. You look at, a nice apartment in some place like in the Greater Capital Regional District on Vancouver Island, you might be paying $3,000 a month for it. Yeah. But you can go, and that might be, one bedroom and a studio type apartment. You go to places like Calgary, and you can rent a 4-bedroom home for $1,800. So you look at it and think, like, affordability is a big problem here in this province. So how do you solve those problems? You can't just artificially bring down, the cost of rent. You can't bring down the cost of food. So how do you solve this? Well, what you need to do everything you can to try to stabilize prices for both housing and food. But you need to see significant wage growth. It's the only way to solve affordability. So you have to reduce the tax burden and see companies being able to be successful so they can pay higher wages. So now you look at it and say, if that is your objective, if that's what you're trying to do to help solve this affordability crisis for the middle class, now what policies need to be put in place? Well, you look at what is a barrier to that success. Well, climate policies are a prime example. For example, we have a low carbon fuel emission standard that's costing us probably between 16 and 18 cents a liter on our fuel. Well, that's money that's just coming directly out of people's pockets for no direct benefit. So let's get rid of it. You've got a industrial carbon tax that is driving up the cost of doing anything in this province. It's not creating any value or benefit to people, so let's get rid of it. You've got things like Clean BC, which has these unrealistic targets in terms of emissions reductions and caps and all this kind of stuff. It's doing more damage than a 25% tariff from the states. It's like more than twice the damage that is being done by this. Get rid of it. Open up our province so that we can actually be successful in attracting capital. Because if you're going to have productivity gains, if you're going to have wage growth, and you need productivity gains to have wage growth, you need to get government out of the way. In the United States, taking real estate out of the scenario, they invest about $55,000 per worker. These are numbers from almost a decade ago now. In Europe, it's about $33,000 per worker. In Canada, it's like $9,000 per worker. Well, you're never going to see the productivity gains. You're never going to see the wage growth that you need without being able to drive that kind of investment. So you have to create the environment for doing it. So get rid of these policies. There's way too much government oversight. So, for example, it can take 15 years to get through a mining process, a process where you can actually build a mine in this province. They say it's 5 years, but I mean, that's just BS. It takes 10 years just to get in the process. You go to a place like Sweden and they do it in 2 years. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Let's just do what they do. They've got easily as high environmental standards as we do. So it's not a matter of dumbing down our environmental standards. You still want to have high environmental standards. You just have to get bureaucracy out of the way. It can take 3 years to get a cutting permit in forestry in British Columbia. You go to Alberta, it takes between 3 and 6 months. Why does it take so long in British Columbia? And all of the permitting that needs to be done is layers upon layers upon layers of bureaucracy. And every government, whether it was the BC Liberals or whether it was the NDP, have added more money and added more people all that has done is added more process. It hasn't actually solved the problem. The answer is less people. The answer is streamlining, cleaning up the process. So, for example, if you're going into a watershed and you're going to be doing some harvesting in there for the next 5 years, and let's say you're going to do 5 or 8 blocks or something like that of cutting, that could be one permit, not the 20 or 30 or 40 permits that are needed today. And so you can reduce the process. When it comes to things like housing, in Greater Victoria area, Greater Vancouver area, I should say, in the city of Vancouver, it can take up to 5 years, 3 to 5 years to get a permit, get a permit through the process. You go to Denmark, which has, arguably a left-wing government and more environmental standards than we have, and it takes 2 months.
Yeah.
Let alone going to Texas where it takes 2 weeks. So right. You look at it and think, okay, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Let's just do what they do. More professional alliance, get rid of these layers of bureaucracy and costs. So this is everything that you need to do to get an economy more successful, drive investment, create those productivity gains to drive wage growth. And the last piece,
go ahead.
If I may continue on a rant here. Sorry about this,
go for it. Go for it. You can keep going, John. You're on a roll.
The last piece, I think, which is important, is you need to have government policy to solve this as well. So not only do you need direct tax relief for individuals and reduce that tax burden, but when it comes to driving wage growth, government can set the stage by encouraging it through taxation. So, for example, we've got, an 11 or 12%, let's say 12% corporate tax rate in British Columbia. If companies are going to give a 5% or greater wage increase on an annual basis, should we then reduce corporate taxes to maybe 7% to encourage the wage growth? So keep it at 12% if you're not giving wage growth, but incrementally for every percentage that you give in wage growth, you can reduce the corporate taxes. So government incentivize companies to pay higher wages. And so these are the kinds of things that you would want to look at to solve this issue over time. So you stabilize prices in terms of food and housing, and you dramatically improve wages over the next decade. And what that does is that rebuilds the middle class in British Columbia.
Great rant, John. Thank you very much for that one. Joel and I are counselors here in the small city of Parksville with maybe a $32 million annual budget sort of. And it's very fast to get your development permit through here. We have an efficient process, so a little plug for the city of Parksville. But from a kind of a devil's advocate, okay, so now you have less money coming into the provincial government. How do you balance the books down there? Are you laying off staff? Property transfer tax is $3 or $4 billion down there coming in. How do you manage your budget down there now that you've cut a bunch of these taxes to make it definitely more affordable for the average BC person?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first thing you need to do is you need to bring in a team from outside of government and go through every ministry line by line in terms of what are you doing? Does it need to be done? Does it need to be improved? Does it need to be changed? And literally just go through every ministry in terms of what government actually does.
Like a Six Sigma kind of group in the corporate world?
You've got it. You bring in the group professionals, maybe some former deputies, bring in professionals from various sectors. There might be different groups for different ministries that you're looking at, but really with that, efficiency lens. Are we getting value for the money we're spending? Like this current government is spending hundreds of millions of dollars annually on third-party groups that promote drug use. Like, why are we doing this? That doesn't need to be done. It can be gone. Government has grown by more than 50% in terms of the public sector. Have we seen any improvements in services over the 10 years? No, there hasn't been any improvements. So what are all these people doing? But what has happened is it's tremendous amounts more processing and et cetera. So we need to be looking at that from an efficiency lens. But that isn't, you're not going to solve the problem just by, reducing the inefficiencies in government. That's part of it. But, for example, I talked about mining. If those 17 mines were to go ahead in this province, just the royalty revenue alone would be $10 billion annually to the province. You're talking about oil and gas. We're selling our natural gas at an 85% discount to the Americans because we can't get it offshore. If we were to see those investments in more LNG facilities, just a $1 difference in the value of our natural gas that we sell is more than $1 billion in revenue to the province. Natural gas prices just a short time ago when I looked at it were $4.50 in North America. We're selling it for 56 cents. If we just had North American prices, that's another $3 or $4 or $5 billion annually that we would be collecting as a province. And so these are the things that you need to look at in terms of that. So just between natural gas and mining, there alone would be enough to take care of the deficit. Now you start talking about the other side of things that provide the tax relief. Like one of the things I was looking at in the previous election, and certainly policies that I'm going to be talking about here a lot in January, we need to see about $4 billion in immediate tax relief for people in this province. But you can't do any of this unless you have that underpinning of driving the investment in BC and opening up, our economy.
This is another thing that I think about being in local government is when you look at, say, a public corporation, there are some pretty clear metrics around whether that corporation is successful or not. You can look at their stock price. Is it going up or down? Market capitalization, profit, all those sorts of things. Obviously, the government is not in the business of turning a profit, but when you do have those metrics, everyone who's working in that company and outside of it can kind of tell whether that company is succeeding at their mission or not. How do we know, though, in government, what metrics can we look at? How do we even keep sort of the public service, the public? How do we know whether it's working well other than just what politicians are saying about it?
That's an interesting question. And Gordon Campbell, when he came in after the disaster that was in the 90s under the NDP, he brought in accountability measures. And so there were expectations of various ministries, of various crowns in terms of reporting. They had set the targets. There was transparency and opening up with that. Christie carried on with that. As soon as the NDP got in, as soon as John Horgan got in, they actually did away with it. So there was no accountability. There was no reporting. There was no measures. I remember I once asked, they brought in under John Horgan, they brought in a bunch of changes to the forest sector policies. And I asked the minister in estimates, I said, so where are your measurements? How would you define success? And the minister at the time says, well, I suppose if there was less logs exported, or if there was this, or if there's that, they hadn't even given any thought to it. They just implement policy without even thinking through what the consequences, intended or otherwise, would be. And so that's a big piece. But you're absolutely right, and accountability is a big piece of it. And I'll just give you an example in healthcare. Germany, with twice the population of Canada has 11 times more health administrators than Germany does. And that actually is much higher even in British Columbia. For example, they hired new administrators across the province for each of the health authorities to manage climate-related illnesses. What the hell is that? And now we've got managers all around the province, and that's their job, and with a whole department underneath them. Like, this is so inefficient in terms of how we actually do things in government. It's quite frankly, it's unbelievable. And most people don't see this. Like, one of my communities here, a little hospital in Fort St. James, a brand new hospital is built. I was talking with the folks that are working there, and they say on a Friday night, they'll hand out as many as 60 crack pipes. 60 crack pipes. Who buys those things? Who manages those? Who ships them around? Who hands them out? That's not actually, delivering health services. It's like, what on earth are we doing? It's government. It's crazy.
With people still paying for their own insulin.
Well, exactly. It's anyway. I mean, you in your neck of the woods, they had the vending machine in Nanaimo at the emergency room at the Nanaimo Hospital that you could push for free and get all kinds of drug paraphernalia, including instructions as to how to use it. There are some things that government is doing that we really don't need to be doing and really shouldn't be doing. And so that's what I mean. So you got to look at those efficiencies, but ultimately to solve the big issue, which is how to, address this massive deficit that's going to bankrupt our province. And that has to be ultimately through driving the investment that's needed in getting our economy going.
Okay, well, we wanted to pivot into, and hopefully we've got a little more time for this one still left, but I'd love it if we could talk a bit about what could potentially be called one of the most consequential 16 months in BC politics. The fallout continues as we watch the political parties shifting around. I'm wondering if you could maybe walk us through a little bit the downfall, maybe you could say, of one of the most successful parties in BC history, at least recent history, the BC Liberal Party, and the transition to BC Conservatives, which maybe starts with the name change. I don't know where we start the story, but can you walk us through how did we get from BC Liberals being government to now BC Conservatives narrowly missing being government?
I'm going to take a little bit of a walk through history, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So Conservatives is the oldest party in British Columbia's history. I think it was first founded around 1903. However, the last time they formed a government was 1927. From there, it was the BC Liberals. The Conservatives were a minority partner in sort of that whole side of things. And as that went through, in the 1940s, it started to fall apart. The NDP at the time, which was called the CCF, I can't even remember what that acronym stands for, but it was basically the Socialist Party at the time, and was a combination with the Labour Party. They were about to form a government, going into the late 40s, early 50s. And at the time, W.A.C. Bennett had left to become an independent with another lady named Ralston. W.A.C. Bennett tried to take over the leadership of the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party wouldn't have him. And so he created this new party called the Social Credit Party. And that spelled the end of the Conservative Party back then. And of course, in history, they managed to win enough votes in what was considered at the time an alternative vote system where it was preferential balloting. The Social Credit was everybody's second choice. They managed to get enough votes in there to win 19 seats, and CCF won 18 seats. And so he consolidated power under the Social Credits. And the Liberals, the BC Liberals at the time, and the Conservative Party basically were amalgamated into the Social Credit Party, and they governed for many years. The coalition fell apart in the 70s with some people that broke off, and that ultimately led to the NDP winning in 72 to 75. It came back together again and continued to govern as the Social Credit Party. So when the Social Credit Party fell apart, which was in 1991, and the NDP won a solid mandate at that point, the center-right coalition split into 3 or 4 different factions at the time. There was the Liberal Party, there was the Reform Party, there was PDA, there was, I can't remember what the other party was called. Anyway, and so that was a period of disruption. And when Gordon Campbell came in, he tried to bring that back together again. And Gordon looked at the options, and at the time, because there really wasn't a Conservative Party, there was a Conservative Party, but I mean, it didn't really exist. Conservative Party wasn't an option. And so he took the faction that was the largest, which was the BC Liberals at the time, and tried to coalesce a coalition government under that. And it failed in 96 because the Reform Party was still out there, which basically was the Conservative Party at the time. It was called the Reform Party because of what was going on with Preston Manning and federally and that whole side of things.
Right.
He was able to put that together as under the BC Liberal banner in 2001. So really, since the 1930s, there really hasn't been a Conservative Party in British Columbia. It has existed, but it's never managed to get enough votes really to get anybody elected. I think it might have elected somebody in the 70s, but that was about it. So when the BC Liberals sort of ran its course, there was, like I say, over that period of time, when we talked about it earlier in terms of the Conservatives being feeling less and less part of that coalition, there was certainly a demand provincially for something different. They weren't happy with the status quo. They weren't happy with the parties. They're looking for something different. And so that's when I was booted out in 2022 from the BC Liberal Party, which then became the United Party. I was planning just to retire at that point, but my wife talked me into staying in politics. And if I was going to stay in politics, that left me only one option, because you can't get anything done as an independent. Mm-hmm. So the only option was to try to find a party. So I actually engaged with the Social Credit Party to try to run the Social Credit Party. And I spent about a month and a half trying to negotiate with them. They ultimately didn't believe that, it was the right path for them. So they wouldn't open it up for membership or anything. So, okay, well, that was that. And then I had to start having more serious talks with the Conservative Party, joined the Conservative Party in February 2023, took over the leadership at the end of March of 2023, and then proceeded to try to build the party. And at the time, everybody was thinking, well, they might be rising the polls, but they're not going to be successful. That was the general thing. And I kept telling people, I said, we could win this election. Nobody would believe me. I said, we can win this election because I could see in the electorate, everywhere I went around the province, there was this demand of this desire for change. And so that was a process that, kept on going through. Then ultimately led to some negotiations with the BC Liberals, which were going nowhere because they basically said, well, we'll give you half a dozen seats to run in. And I just told them to go pound sand, forget it. They don't realize that, they're the coyote that's already walked off the cliff. They don't realize that they're about to collapse. They came to the realization in June that they were out of money and they're having a real problem, but they refused to sit down and actually negotiate until they basically did completely run out of money, which was the end of August. Then they came and said, okay, we gotta end this thing right away. And it actually took a grand total of a meeting on a Sunday between some staff on both sides, which led to another meeting on a Tuesday, which then Kevin Falcon came in and met with them. And then they wanted to meet with me. So it was Tuesday night at 9:00 was my schedule finally got free. And we sat down, Kevin and I sat down for 2 hours talking about doing this. And we agreed and we finished the details on Wednesday morning and then announced it. So it came together quite quickly at the end. But
Kevin Falcon was quite clearly running to be premier, not just leader of whatever. So that must have been a pretty significant decision. Like how does a guy who's looking to be premier go from that to not running at all?
Yeah, it's an interesting path. One day he will tell his whole story in terms of it, I'm sure. I know it would have been extremely difficult for him, but he came to the understanding because they ran out of money. Right at the end of the day, when the Liberals shut down, they had a debt, and he had spent the money from the riding accounts as well as the money internally that they had. He basically ran them out of money and then realized that, well, there was no option at this point. The party was going bankrupt, and so ultimately that's what brought him to the conclusion to exit. If he hadn't been quite so stubborn about the whole thing, we probably could have done some sort of agreement much earlier, which would have changed quite a bit in terms of what we did going into the election. We'd had time to do nomination meetings. It would have been quite a different path, I think, than with one that we were on going into the 2024 election. I mean, ultimately, we had 3 weeks after they pulled the pin. We had 3 weeks to try to put it all together and run an election.
Right.
Not a lot of time to do all the prepping and work that needed to be done.
Yeah, and the BC United at the time would have been a much more organized operation than the BC Conservatives, and they put their tools down and allowed the BC Conservatives to take over.
They had all the structure. I mean, they had decades and decades of structure and software and databases and everything else, and we had none of that. So we went into the election planning, like at the beginning of September, before they pulled the pin, before the BC Liberals pulled the pin, we were planning on running like a $2 or $3 million campaign. And after they pulled the pin, of course, money started coming in. We took out a loan, et cetera. We ended up running like a $9 or $10 million campaign. But you can imagine gearing up and trying to be effective in terms of actually spending that money and doing that properly was not easy.
Now that we've looked back, John, thinking of looking forward, there's going to be a leadership contest for the BC Conservative Party. How can that new leader unite the BC Conservative MLAs to put their best foot forward in whenever that provincial election might be called?
Yeah, and this is the challenge. And when I put this Conservative Party together and built it over that year and a half going into the election, I made it a very broad base. People on the extreme right, people on the far left, as well as people in the center. And in hindsight, probably shouldn't have made it that big a tent. Because there was people on the far right that weren't happy with some of the people on the left. There's people on the left that were not happy with what was going on the right, and there was people in the middle that were upset because there was too much turmoil that was going on with all of it. So it was a challenge.
Was that a deliberate sort of choice to do that, to try to get a really broad range of people into the tent, or how did that come about?
When I was putting the party together, I always used to say it's not about being conservative or liberal or NDP or Green. It's just standing for what's right and fighting for the average everyday person. And so lots of people fit into that category when you were talking about things at a very high level. When it came to actually talking about implementing or doing things, that's where you started to see the divides that were created. But when I was putting this thing together, I was convinced that David Eby would drop the writ for an election in March of 2024 because the two parties were divided. They were still there. The NDP would have walked to a solid majority. He would have rode off as a hero, and we would have been dealing with the fallout of the two parties afterwards. For whatever reason, David Eby decided not to do that. And I thought he was crazy, quite frankly, to not do it. But, that's probably how I would define David Eby to begin with anyway. But regardless of that, so we did everything we could to get candidates in place by the end of February. And so that meant we did not do a lot of vetting. And we were basically just looking for people that were willing to run for a party that at the time was only 25, 26 points in the polls. And the chances of people getting elected were not high. And so that became a problem. But as that changed, there's lots of people saying, well, we should open it up for nominations instead of having the people nominated. But, one of my flaws is I'm a very loyal person. I'm loyal to people. And so, even though I could see we were going to have some problems with some of our people, I stuck with them instead of replacing them.
So how would that have been played out, do you think, had the BC Conservatives formed government?
Well, it would have been a challenge, I think, for sure. Thinking back to that election, there were so many things that could have been done a little bit different that would have seen us, with a different outcome. But it was about 1,000 or 1,200 votes was the difference between them forming government with 47 and us having like 51 or 52 seats.
Right.
So, when you're in that kind of a majority situation, there's a lot of things that play out differently in terms of how you're governing and doing things, because now you're dealing with the day-to-day stuff of getting stuff done. You're not so much focused on, people's individual agendas.
Right. I assume it would probably be easier to keep folks together if they're forming government versus yeah. So now we're looking.
Like I said at the beginning, right? Government has its own way of having that loyalty and control.
Yeah. Well, I think, a couple of things maybe to wrap up the conversation. Really appreciate your spending this time with us and sharing your background on all these interesting topics. But I'd love to get into a little bit of maybe some advice you might have, having now a lot of experience with the BC legislature and the operations of that. What advice would you have for someone considering a run for MLA? And what advice might you have for leadership contestants? I'd love to hear your thoughts on what people should know about if they're thinking of getting into this kind of thing that you've been doing for quite a while.
Well, first of all, I encourage everybody to run, become an MLA. And the reason I do that is the people who are most reluctant to run for office are often the best MLAs because they're there for the right reasons. Because it's not about money or it's not about, power or those kinds of things. They're there to get a job done. And so I encourage particularly people who are reluctant to run to actually step up to the plate. And it is very rewarding unto itself. You get crapped on, you get all kinds of problems and issues. The hours are horrendous. You're spending time away from family all the time. It's not easy, but the real reward is when you know that you've made a difference in somebody's life, that you've been able to help somebody. And I've had many, many examples, everything from a grandmother trying to adopt a grandchild to a young lady who was living on the streets, got into an education program, to helping seniors get a new wheelchair for their handicapped daughter. All these kinds of things that are very rewarding to know that you've been able to help an individual. When it comes to leadership, my biggest advice to people in leadership is to understand the current political environment. Historically, everybody views politics as being a bell curve, where you've got people on the extreme right, you've got people on the extreme left, and the vast majority of people are in the middle. I actually think that's changed. And this has happened from time to time throughout history. And what I mean by that is I actually think people become more polarized. There's fewer people left in the middle, and there's more people that are polarized on the left and right. You still have the extremes, but it's kind of like two humps in terms of where people are politically. And understanding that is going to be an important piece in terms of your leadership. So you've got to decide where you want to be on that spectrum how you're going to relate to those various people, and understanding that there's still people in the middle that you need, but it is not the largest group in the political spectrum anymore because of where things are. And so my advice to anybody who wants to take on being leader of the Conservative Party is to have courage of your convictions. What do you stand for? Don't try to be wishy-washy. Don't try to be something you're not. Be authentic. Stand for those values that you believe are the right thing to be doing for the province of British Columbia, and let the chips fall where they may.
I guess good life advice generally, to be authentic. Looking forward, in the province has a lot of challenges ahead of it. What do you see the next sort of 5-10 years? How do we resolve these challenges? What role is there for the provincial government to solve these challenges? What can we solve as a provincial government? And what do you see the Conservative Party's role in that?
So I think we have a huge challenge as they go over the next decade. Not just fiscal challenges or getting the economy going, but societal challenges. And I do wonder, will Canada stay together as a country over that period of time? And I don't ask that question lightly. Because one of the things that I've always talked about is I believe we need to renew Confederation. This is the best country in the world. We've got everything we could ever want, but it's hopelessly managed and has been for decades. We need to look at how do you renew Confederation. So if you're to take the 10 provinces and 3 territories today and try to come together and say, let's build this entity called Canada, what would that look like? Where would you divide the authorities and responsibilities? How would you address these issues? How do you make sure you unleash the economic potential while still being able to have a sense of who we are as a country? How do you get rid of the trade barriers, all the rest of this nonsense that's been going on? So I think that is our biggest challenge as a country. And it's not just our country. The United States may not even stay together as a country. Other places, Europe's, the EU, will no longer exist a decade from now. So there's all kinds of big issues that are out there. But I look at it and think this is the challenge for all leaders in British Columbia and elsewhere that we have to be thinking about. We have to be able to understand that there is change afoot, and how do we then take that and embrace it and make sure that we can come out as a stronger nation and as a stronger society. So I think overall that's a big piece that needs to be done. And beyond that, I think another big piece that needs to be thought about in terms of what will happen over the next decade is if we are unable to move away from ideologically driven government, then I don't have a whole lot of hope for us being successful as a province. We need to be able to do what I call constructive destruction of the status quo. You need to be able to fundamentally structure and change and set us on a different course. Otherwise, we're on a path that's going to lead to bankruptcy. And we're going to have a path that's going to be on a continual decline of services and of quality of life. Not exactly what I'd like to see us leaving for the next generation. Those are some big concepts.
Yeah,
Sorry about dropping that at the end of the session. But probably justify a whole new podcast just to get into those topics.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, I guess I can open it up then. If there's anything else that you'd like to speak to before we wrap up, definitely would love to hear anything else that comes to mind.
In closing, I would maybe just say this: we are a small open trading jurisdiction. And British Columbia broadly, but Canada as well, 60, 70 years ago used to be viewed as the place that you were going to come for opportunity and investment. And today, nobody sees British Columbia or Canada in that light. We are no longer considered a place to go. Everybody is looking elsewhere to invest. Everybody's looking elsewhere to be able to, achieve a dream. And when half the young population in this province are thinking about leaving British Columbia, you've got a serious problem for your future. Unless we can change course, that is what we're facing. People leaving, the brain drain will happen, quality of life drops. So I think, in closing, we have to figure out who we are as a province And part of that is who we are as a country. We have to embrace our natural benefits, our natural resources. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that we maintain what we have become. We are the most ethnically diverse jurisdiction in the world. We have people from all around the world. We become this melding pot that works. And right now, I think we're on the risk of tearing ourselves apart because of the other problems. And we're pointing to people saying it's their fault. And that's wrong. It's not that. It's government's fault that is the problem. Government hasn't set the stage for success. I'm an optimist. Despite the fact of all the things I've just talked about and the challenges and issues, I actually think British Columbia could become the Norway of North America. We have everything you could ever want. We've got tens of trillions of dollars of natural gas. We've got billions and billions of dollars worth of oil. We've got all the mining. We've got a vast renewable forest sector. Take advantage of those resources so that we can build a better society. There's one more little piece, though, I think we should really be thinking about, and this goes back to a little bit of climate policy. AI is going to dramatically change the world. And it's like the internet or the introduction of so many other technologies over time. It will dramatically change the world. Question is, are we going to embrace it, or are we going to just be consequences of it actually happening? We've got all the natural gas, cheap natural gas. We could be generating tremendous amounts of electricity. We could be hosting AI in this province, data centers. We could create a whole different technology. It will transform how government works. It can transform how healthcare works. It'll transform how productivity happens. Are we willing to just let it happen to us, or are we going to be drivers? And I think, quite frankly, that with the right government and right approach, we can be drivers of this technology and really become a forefront. And just to that extent, I was meeting with the consulate generals of various nations around the Pacific Rim and talking about various things. And one of the things I did talk about was AI and data centers. And they all want to be able to host these things in their country. And I'm like, well, you're buying natural gas at $12 and creating electricity to do this. We could generate the electricity here in BC and host it for you, so that it's your center, but we could host it here in British Columbia. We could create an entirely new industry in this province. And I think, so I'm optimistic. I think there's lots of things that we could be doing if we had a government that takes a different approach and opens up our potential. Because it's really remarkable what British Columbia could become.
Well, John, thank you very much for that. You kind of ended on a much higher note, which is great, and it speaks to the optimism in you. And you have to know the problems ahead of time to be that optimist, so you can what problems you're trying to fix, which you definitely spoke to there. John, really can't thank you enough for taking the time to walk through your thinking on leadership, governance, the BC economy, and where the province is headed.
I appreciate the opportunity. As I've said in my departing comments to the media, I'm not going anywhere. I'm planning to be able to continue to engage politically on all kinds of ideas, put stuff out there. As a matter of fact, come January, I want to start putting out a series of what I think a platform should look like, and what I would have been doing. Leadership candidates can take it or not, whatever they want to do, but I want to get that out there. And I actually think we run a pretty big risk of there being an election starting in January. Mm-hmm. So we'll see if it plays out.
Yeah, definitely a possibility there. Yeah, I'm going to echo Sean. Very grateful for you to spend some time with us today, providing your background and insights and the things you've learned along the way. And just going to mention for our listeners that you can find more episodes and background about our episodes on nonpartisanhacks.com. With that, that's a wrap on this episode of Nonpartisan Hacks.
If you've got a guest suggestion, a good government story, or a topic we should tackle, send it our way. Until then, take care of yourself and your community.
Ian Lindsay of Lindsay & Associates has played an active role in the local community since 1979. He has been with RE/MAX, Vancouver Island's most advanced real estate business network, since 1996. Marketing and selling residential, rural, strata, recreational, investment, and project development real estate. You'll find true real estate professionals at ianlindsay.ca